This slideshow is on lesson planning with technology and is designed to provide you with some background information for lesson planning as well as for preparing your collaborative lesson plan with your group members. There are three planning components that we're going to spend some time looking at. One is instruction, two is assessment, and three is curriculum. In essence, these three planning components overlap, and yet what we're looking for is that sweet spot in the center, which doesn't occur usually very naturally. We have to work towards that. So let's investigate a little bit more. Curriculum. Curriculum is the what should be learned. It includes all of the content, the standards, the benchmarks for that particular lesson. What do we expect students to be studying? And that is the basis for curriculum. It is generally, as you know, probably the curriculum has been recently in the news with Common Core, and it has been nationalized, but there has been resistance to that, and Florida, in fact, has opted out of Common Core and created their own state curriculum, although it's very, very similar to Common Core, just a new name added to that. Private schools, on the other hand, would have their own standards, and usually they're pretty closely aligned, but if they're religious schools, they would have some additional standards that would be religious oriented. Another planning component is instruction, and this is basically one of the really important components that you have within your classroom, how you're going to teach that curriculum. And here you're going to focus on strategies that are going to be effective for making sure that students can learn. You've already completed the instructional strategies wiki and therefore have the background knowledge from some of Marzano's high yield effective strategies. And you might want to go back and review those and look at how you might be able to use some of those. But don't forget that the main focus of this class is technology. So we want to make sure that you integrate technology into your lesson. And that's not just for the purpose of making sure that the teacher uses it for productivity purposes, but also that students have the opportunity maybe to use it in their understanding of that content. So keep your mind open on all of that as you look at the instructional piece of that planning component. This in the lesson template will be the section that says lesson activities, and it will be relatively detailed. It should be something that you could give a substitute teacher, and it would have step-by-step instruction of what they're to do in the classroom that day. And the third planning component is assessment. And of course, now that we have determined what we're going to teach and how we're going to teach it, we have to make sure that we've accomplished our goals. And really, if our goal is student learning, we have to make sure that we assess the student well and have a better understanding of what they have learned. So the best way for us to assess is, as we look at technology, is usually doing something in terms of a project of some kind, maybe a skit, or maybe they create a PowerPoint or a Prezi. And all of that could be readily assessed in using a rubric as opposed to a traditional test. It's a lot more authentic to do it that way, and sometimes peers will assess as opposed to teachers, or maybe even it will be posted out on a website and others will be looking at that. So curriculum, instruction, and assessment are the three big planning components as you begin to think about how to develop your collaborative lesson plan. In developing lessons, the book chapter talked about two models. And one is a very straightforward student learning objectives, looks at those questions of who, what, when, how much, how often. And that's, again, very straightforward, and it can provide you with the basis for a lesson. The one that's a little more complex and actually a little bit more interesting as we look at inquiry-based lessons is that one, understanding by design. Here you do it sort of backwards design, where you identify what you want students to be able to know, what they'll be able to do first. And then you determine, well, how am I going to, if I want them to learn this, how am I going to determine that they have done that before you do the big piece of planning those learning experiences? In other words, many times people, when they plan a lesson, they say, oh, I want to do this in class today or tomorrow. And I can find an objective that matches up with that, and then I'll come up with an assessment. Instead of this understanding backwards by design, which really means that we're focused on the student learning, not on what we're doing in class, but on what the students are learning. And that's kind of a different mindset for a lot of people because it's not the easiest way to do things. So let's go back and look at curriculum for a second. The standards, as I mentioned, there are state standards, and they're not called Sunshine State Standards anymore. They are actually, I think on the website, it's the CPALM website, and that is in your module page. Common Core, the link for the Common Core is also in the module page. And in your book, again, the page number may not line up, but there are subject area curriculum. And more, as we go into looking at the technology, we need to assess what kind of standards, technology-based, for students. So the National Educational Technology Standards for students are in the inside cover of your book. There's also a link, and it will begin to provide you with that basis of how are you getting students involved. You'll want to use at least one standard from either the national or the state, and then at least one standard from the NETs in your lesson plan. So begin to focus in on those, and you'll want to be very specific as to what they are. Spell them out. Put the letter and the numbers, often preceded by, when you begin to look at those standards. Just like we're doing this for a collaborative lesson plan, in the class that you're taking right now, EME 2040, there are NETs, and that's for teachers. So we do want to continue to move and look around those. Assessment piece. There are a couple definitions you should be familiar with: standards-based versus performance-based testing. Standards-based testing is that which is more along the lines of a standardized test, and the performance-based is something that demonstrates what the student can do. Usually it's in the form of making something, creating something. Formative versus summative. Formative assessment are very powerful tools because they provide you with what the student is learning along the way, versus the summative, which is the very end grade. So it's important that we have both, but if we put too much emphasis on the summative grade and have not done anything formatively along the way, it's really not a very positive learning experience. In terms of technology, clickers used to be very popular, but they've kind of been overtaken by the BYOD movement, which means that students bring their own device and already have sort of a built-in clicker with their cell phone for some of the Web 2.0 tools like Socrative and Kahoot and Infused Learning, some of those. But one of the most powerful and valuable types of assessment is rubrics, and you already have had the experience not only of creating your own and using it on evaluating a web page, but you also are evaluated on rubrics on every single project that you do for this class. So that's a good one to keep in mind for assessment. Doesn't always have to be, again, assessed by the teacher. can be done by peers or an authentic audience, but it is something to keep in mind as you look at developing your own lesson plan. There are some links right there with Rubistar, Teachnology, Tech for Learning, and iRubric that I believe I have incorporated in a previous module, but I'll try and direct you back to those if you can't find them. Okay. In looking at instruction, I just want to point out that there are lots of different stages when we think about how to use technology in instruction. I really do want you to be focused not just on how a teacher might go and get a YouTube that is related to this particular content, but what can students do? How are you going to help those students meet their goals? You've covered, many of you have done a lot of different digital tools for your blog postings. That might give you some ideas. There are lots of ideas in your book. In fact, they're at the end of chapters, I believe it's 5 through 10 or 11. At the end of the chapter, there is a lesson plan that has been created to give you an idea of what you could do. So there are lots of opportunities for kind of looking at what's already been done and using that as a springboard for creating your own. Now, you are working on this together as a group. You will hopefully find a way for everyone to contribute to this lesson plan, but there will not be parts identified as so-and-so did this part and so did this part. Just like in the real world, you're asked to do something as a group and it comes together as a product and then it's submitted as a product. You'll each need to submit your own so that I can provide a grade for you, which means that one person will need to pull everything together. And then, unless you do something like out on Google Docs where everybody's working on it together, and then what you'll want to do is make sure that everybody gets a copy of the final product. There should be no differences between student A, student B, student C, student D. With the one exception, and that is there is a collaboration rubric that's included in the module page. That collaboration rubric gives you a chance to evaluate your other team members, replicate it for each one of those team members. It's a simple one, but make sure that you've indicated to me how, if you're student A, how student B, C, and D performed in your eyes. I use that sometimes to tweak the grade because sometimes people are not living up to their own contribution and I don't want them to get the easy ride for not doing anything. But it is important that you know that that is anonymous. It's not anonymous, but it is not shared with anyone else. So you would be creating your own rubrics, evaluating everyone, and submitting that directly to me along with your collaborative lesson plan. So I hope that helps. You're going to remember that you're going to have 2 weeks to work on this. And so you should have plenty of time to kind of pull things together. I would suggest that you get together with everyone. Don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the grade and the subject. Get moving on an idea. Split up how you perceive the equal duties of putting this together. The lesson activities will take the longest and should be the longest on your paper in describing those. But there are lots of other smaller pieces that need to be pulled together as well. Everyone, again, should have a role in doing this. The lesson plan also needs to be very complete. In other words, if you use a Prezi to share with your students some of the content, you need to create that Prezi. If you use a rubric, and say we're going to assess the students based on, you need to include that rubric.